Hello and welcome to Altadena Library District's spotlight on comics retailer Joe Field. Joe is quite a history behind him. He's a pioneering retailer. He's the brainstormer, the inventor of Free Comic Book Day, amongst many other things. He's got a store up north in Concord, California called Flying Colors Comics and Other Cool Stuff, which I had the distinct pleasure of working for many years ago. As my daughter says, in the 1900s. So welcome, Joe. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's good to see you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
Super. Well, I wanted to start off, like I know bits of your story from long ago, but we're here with an audience. Or we will be here with an audience. So how did you get into comics? What was your first big thing, your favorite thing in comics?
When I was a kid, comics were everywhere. They were at the grocery store, they were at the toy store, they were everywhere. So comics were always ubiquitous in my early childhood, but I wasn't really a dedicated comics reader. I can just remember some of the stepping stones that got me into comics in a big way. And the major stepping stones that I remember were, I was about 5 years old and my mom wanted to visit with her older sister at her older sister's house. And so my aunt knew that there were going to be two young boys who wanted to do nothing but interrupt their conversation. So she bought a stack of comics for us to occupy ourselves while she could have a nice cup of tea with my mom. And those comics included things like Woody Woodpecker and Deputy Dog and the Terry Toons and stuff that was animated related. That we were Huckleberry Hound was a big one back then. But it wasn't until and then comics were there all the way through. But when I was 11, I on the third day of summer, teaching a 4-year-old how to climb trees, I fell about 25 feet from a tree, breaking my arm in several places. Ouch. Needed surgery and needed to spend a night in the hospital. And there were comics in the hospital. But when I got home, the neighbor kids gave me little get well gifts. And my lifelong pal, Steve, brought me 2 comic books. He brought Amazing Spider-Man 51, which is the second part of the first Kingpin story, and Fantastic Four 65, which was one of the first appearance of Ronan the Accuser, and it was part of the whole Kree Empire thing that has become so huge in the movies. But that was my entry, and instead of a summer filled with swimming and baseball and hiking and all those other kinds of physical activities, 1967 for me was not the summer of love. It was the summer of comics, and we did everything we could to hunt them down. It was a psychedelic time in music, and it was in comics too. It was a beautiful way to get in.
Yeah, it definitely. Just for those of you out there who are turning in out of curiosity, it was this is part of what they call the sort of Marvel Revolution. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and many other talented people were creating these comics that had this great pizzazz and dynamism and energy, and Stan Lee had this wonderful, everyone knows who he is now, not so much back in the day, but he has this pizzazz with his dialogue and all of that stuff, and that was really different from comics at the time. So this stuff you're talking about, this is like kind of exciting, when you go back and look at it and you see what else was around, which was really great stuff too. But yeah, these guys really had it.
The thing that Marvel had going on at that time, I think, really was that they made their comics a whole lot more. It was almost like you were buying a diorama rather than a comic, because the stuff just leapt off the page, and the collages that Jack Kirby would put into some of his things, and the crazy colors that Steve Ditko would incorporate into Doctor Strange, and just the teen angst that would be all over Spider-Man. These were things that just pulled up off the page, where most of the other comics on the rack, well, they just looked like comic books.
Yeah, as Alan Moore said somewhere in an interview, all the DC heroes, he loves the DC universe, it's full of
Yes.
imagination. He said all the DC heroes were like your uncle and your auntie. They were all mature and well settled. And then there was the Marvel heroes who were always having, bum tickers and or being a teenager and having to deal with your aunt or just arguing,
It's it's a really odd thing when you go back and look at who was doing the comics for each of the companies, and the basic demographic of a comic book writer and artist was about the same for both companies, but it sure felt like the people who were working for DC were these middle-aged men trying to talk to 14-year-olds, where it felt like Stan Lee and Kirby and Ditko and Romita and Buscema and some Steranko and those great talents were speaking at somebody who was older than I was, and I wanted to be in on that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, that's in part of the theme of our discussion is fandom, and also how all ages comics grew. But back in the day, comics were considered a kid's market. There were people who were older, and Marvel did sort of start to capture college students and onward and onward and onward. So comics were an issue. I mean, did you know anyone who was older who read comics back then?
I'll tell you a story, and this is one of those. I felt like I got my knighthood with this story, and that is that when I was about 14, one of the older boys in our town in Moraga was going off to college, and he didn't want to sell his comics. He wanted to find the person who was worthy to accept his comics. And he found me, and he deemed me worthy to take on his beautiful collection of old comics. And so that was my entry into DC Comics of the late 50s and early 60s. And to this day, I'm very thankful for him, and what he does. What he did for me behind the scenes was he showed me that it's a whole lot more than about what the monetary value of a comic book is. It's really that maybe that was my first taste of fandom, but it was really something, a good person trying to do something for someone he also felt was good, and that's comics at its core.
Yeah, definitely. That sharing, that reminds me that I my grandparents, my family is from England, but I was born in America, so we'd travel back there and to visit my grandparents. And the family that lived behind my grandmother's house, they had these interlocking backyards. There was a boy there who I didn't see very often. To me, he was a young man. He was 18 or 19, and he had a big collection of Marvel British reprints of all the stuff, and he gave them to my grandmother to give to me, this huge stack. So that's how I got to read all the early Marvel stuff. It was actually in two-tone. It was strange.
Oh,
but
yeah.
That same act of sharing, which is one of the things that's at the heart of fandom, is that we read these things, but we love to share it. Maybe we're extroverts, maybe we're introverts, but we're nowadays we can go on the internet and we can find fans everywhere, and we can watch discussions, and it's pretty amazing.
When I was 12, one of my best friends and his family went to Europe for a summer vacation. He brought back from France one of those two-tone digest size reprints of Marvel Comics that reprinted Fantastic Four 20 and 21, I think, and I still have that. And it's that was his way of saying, I was thinking about you when I was 6,000 miles away. And that's some gifts you never forget, and that's one of them. And I think that's kind of the sort of the basis of fandom, is that when people find others who share the same interests, we all want to kind of gather together and move forward, and find what we love and share what we love. And we did that from the time I was 12 years old into being into comics. And so I've tried, as much as I'm a businessman, I still try to extend that into what I do here.
Right, right. So when did you, I wanted to touch on sort of San Diego Comic-Con, which goes
Sure.
all the way back to the 70s and all, but also like, how did you, because most people have a period where they're into comics and maybe they move away a little bit. And I know that you may have done it and you come back to it, but when did you become aware that there was this larger world of conventions? I mean, maybe it was when you were younger.
The convention thing was sort of off my field of view. I think the first convention I went to, I believe, was called Americon, that was in San Jose, California. And that was probably 1983. So I was already 27 or 28 years old at that point. I knew there were conventions before that, and I'd read some fanzines before that, but it was, I never had enough money to really gather enough to go to a convention and be able to, play that game. But my fandom really came through other people locally. I can remember the first time seeing a back issue comic for a sale above cover price, and that was a little shop in Lafayette, California. It blew my mind that they had old comics, and at that point, old meant 3 or 4 or 5 years. But my friend and I went in there and saw an Amazing Spider-Man #1, and it was for sale for the princely sum of $5. And I turned to my friend and I said, "No way I'm ever paying $5 for a comic book." And then I can think of a few years later finding the stores in Berkeley and making the deal where I would hitchhike from Moraga to Lafayette to get on BART to take into Berkeley to visit the comic shops there. And the comic shops there had original art for sale, but they started at $5. You could get an Al Williamson page for $10 or a Kirby page for $5. But I looked at that and I said, I don't know if it's real or if it's bootleg, because Berkeley was full of bootlegs. And for $5 at that point, that was a whole stack of comics. So I opted for the comics rather than the other stuff. But that was me getting pulled into more of the fandom and seeing what was out there. So really, I think comics fandom really started to take off when comic book stores started to exist. And so in this area, we had the first chain of comic book stores in the US, which was Comics and Comics. And I'd give them a lot of credit for sort of creating comics fandom out of just their love of what they were doing.
And now, so at this point, well, in the 80s, I know you were working in radio.
Yeah.
In sales and advertising, and then you had an epiphany.
Yeah. So yeah, from 78 to 88, I worked for a radio station, KJOY, KJoy, out in Stockton, California. And I had given up comics. I sold my first collection to pay for my last year of college in 1977, 78. I went to work at KJoy in 78, got married in 79. And when my wife and I were starting our family, I thought I'd love to pass on my love of comics to my kids. So I started buying comics again. And really, if I look back on it, it was really me just wanting to get back into comics and hoping that they might like them later. Now, my 3 daughters don't care a whole lot about my love of Steve Ditko or Jack Kirby, but they all love comics. But in 1985, I saw Marvel's 25th anniversary rolling around and thought it would be a cool idea to do something for Stockton, get publicity for the radio station, and do something with comics. So I petitioned Marvel Comics to have Stockton named the official home of the Fantastic Four. And there's some arcane comics continuity that ties in with that, but the people working at Marvel had other ideas. My idea was to take Central City, which was where the Fantastic Four were from originally, and change it to Stockton. Well, they had this great story that they were working on. They were going to take Central City and shoot it 10,000 years into the future after obliterating it. So we didn't want that happening to Stockton. And it wasn't until Stan Lee stepped in and got wind of this and was interviewed by the LA Times that, you know, he said his famous line was, we save universes on a daily basis. This is the least we can do for little old Stockton. And sure enough, you know, the whole thing happened, and that's how I met Stan. And that was really my segue into comics as a full-time deal.
And what at what point did you decide to start a shop, and what was that? You know, when you're looking at it, obviously viable business, you make those calculations, but your approach to this kind of store you wanted was different from a lot of the stores that were selling comics. Like when I started buying what they call direct market comics, which is like the new issues that are ahead of the newsstands by a month, you know, it was always in a record store that had comics, or a bookstore, used bookstores that had comics. And but what you were doing was quite different than that. Well,
I went through a period of self-evaluation about not being a very good employee at the radio station. I was too much of a control freak in what I was doing there. But then I interviewed with advertising agencies, wanted to get in and do that. I was a pretty good copywriter at that point. I then thought, okay, I'm going to do a syndicated radio show about comics and pop culture. And so that was my first trip to San Diego Comic-Con, was to gather interviews to put together demo tapes to send out to the syndication houses. And after about literally 20 rejection letters for this thing that none of the syndicates wanted, I thought, what else am I going to do? The advertising thing wasn't working out. The radio thing was coming to an end. So after the Stan Lee in Stockton thing happened, I was invited by Bay Area comics retailers to do their promotions and advertising for them for a new convention that they were starting up, which became WonderCon. And that led me to hanging out with some of the Bay Area comics retailers who've all become friends of mine over the years. And I saw that they were having a pretty good time doing what they were doing. And it seemed like they were bringing just a lot of happiness to a lot of people, including themselves, doing what they were doing. So my goal was always to live back in the area where I grew up. And even though I interviewed with Marvel Comics and DC and Eclipse and Diamond and Bud Plant and a number of these other companies in the comics business to do marketing or sales, they all came back to me and said, you have no publishing experience. And I said, okay, I'll show you guys. And I really, really just wanted to live back in Contra Costa County in this beautiful area of the world by Mount Diablo. And the way to do that was to do my own thing. And so I did a lot of research into all the shops that were open in Northern California at the time. And with the help of my father and father-in-law and Mike Friedrich, a former comics writer, and others, they all sort of consulted with me on putting this thing together. And I'll give credit right now. My wife and three daughters, my daughters were quite young. You remember when the store opened, they were between the ages of 4 and 8. And along with my wife, Libby, they were my marketing research team. We went to every comic book store we could find, and then other kinds of stores. And we would then take notes. What did we like? What didn't we like? What will we want in a comic book store that's not here? And we had all kinds of crazy experiences doing that. But it really changed how this business was going to look from the outset. And we wouldn't have even gotten the lease here if the landlord at that point hadn't met Libby, because when he heard comic book store, he looked at the other ones in the area and said, I don't want that in my shopping center. But when he met her, he said, okay, I'm in love. I'll I'll do the deal. So fortunately, that worked out well.
Nice. Yeah. So when you started, I remember you telling me that, obviously you're selling comics and that's what you're doing, but you also positioned it as a pop culture store. And
Right.
I remember you saying, telling me in the early days, that you wanted the kind of experience where anyone felt, it looked different. It looked like a cool store. It didn't look like a used bookstore with comics. It was a professional retail place that sold comics and pop culture, and that you wanted, if a grandparent came in, hopefully they could find maybe a collection of strips from the 30s or 40s. If
Yeah.
it was a young kid, you wanted everyone to find something in the store, which is a very, very different approach
Yeah,
to
the
comics.
whole idea was initially that we worked on the motto that it would be the one comic store for the whole family. And
Right.
with that, we brought in things like Far Side items and Applause plush toys and movie-related items and posters and greeting cards and the comic strip collection. We sold tons of Calvin and Hobbes and always have. But the idea was I wanted the vision that we really conceived of at that point was the traditional family, mom, dad, two kids are able to walk in the store and each one of them fans out to find something that they're really going to latch onto and have a great time with. And I can't tell you how many times we've seen that exact vision play out here over the course of the last 32 plus years. And while that vision is a little bit more expansive now, it's still sort of the core of what we do.
Yeah, no, I remember, all the customers coming in. You had your sort of, your comics fans, but I remember families coming in and kids looking for things, and I mean, all before my eyes. It was amazing. It was a real learning experience to work there, and an honor too. It's a great place, and you're a great boss, by the way. 30 years, you're like the top three. Yeah.
I wonder if we got all of the alumni together, if we put that to a vote, how it would turn out. What I will tell you is that when I think of those early years, when just after we opened, a young girl found us, and she would raid the quarter box for old comics, and she was about 10 years old when she started coming in. At the age of 12, she announced to me that when she grew up, she was going to be writing the X-Men, and the first place she would sign it would be at Flying Colors. And that's another one of those visions that sounds kind of crazy, but fast forward close to 30 years, and she got hired to write the X-Men. She did, and the first place she signed in was here. And she's a very well-known author of urban fantasy and horror and whatnot. Her name is Shannon Mcguire. She also writes under the name of Mira Grant, but she has, a long list of published books behind her. And the thing that she wanted to do from being a very young girl was to write comics and write the X-Men. And she told me that when she found this store, she felt like she found her home, and that even as a young girl going into other comic book stores, they would kind of look down their noses at her and kind of brush her off and scoot her along, but that she felt welcome here and knew that she was in good hands. And it's, I'll take a little bit of pride in that. I know we've sort of, I don't know, inspired other people to get into media in one way or another. And I, when I've gone to San Diego Comic-Con, I'll get a tap on the shoulder and it'd be, hey, do you remember me? When I was 12 years old, I used to come into your store, and now I'm working on this TV show, or I'm starring in this thing, or like, awesome. if I helped anybody find their way, I'm happy about that.
Yeah, that's a great story. I mean, Shannon Mcguire, we have many of their books at the library. That's an amazing story. Yeah, it's in a way, what you're doing is very similar to some aspects of being working in a library, being a librarian, which is you want to connect people with resource, you want to give them access, want to help them, help them find whatever it is they are looking for or they don't know that they're looking for. And that does change people, especially when you get people early on. Like you said, it's a safe space, and it's a home space, and it's a space of discovery. And I know, I remember the store. It was incredible in 1989, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
88 we opened. Yeah, late 88. Yeah.
89. Yeah. So let's so how what's your perspective on sort of fandom growing, through the 90s? So now we have this sort of period. In the last 20 years, we've started to see superhero movies, which of course is superheroes are a slice of the comic book,
Yeah.
art form and market. They tend to be foregrounded. Like everyone's heard of, Superman and Spider-Man. Even back in the day, people had heard these things, but people weren't so familiar with Tintin collections, although they were here.
Yeah.
Or Asterix, or sort of things that are more all ages. How do you see sort of comics for all ages and kids evolving? What sort of began to expand that market? Because I remember once we were talking about Michael Chabon, the author. He gave us a speech at the Eisner Awards, which are like the Academy Awards for comics, founded in honor of Will Eisner, incredibly influential artist and businessman. And Michael Chabon was saying, well, we are saying there's not enough stuff for comics for kids. And the publishers would say, well, nobody buys the comics for kids. And then Michael Chabon's side of the argument was, that's because you're not making the comics for kids. So it was this weird circular thing.
Yeah.
But, and a lot of comics fans at the time, again, a lot of people, especially in the earlier days, I think it was a big percentage of Marvel and DC going to these conventions, the fans. But there was this whole other world growing all along and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's the all ages market. So if maybe you could speak to that.
Well, there's that argument of you're not going to make it, we're not going to sell it, and blah blah blah. That's like it's like a Mobius band of frustration, right? But outside of that small little universe that kind of eats itself, there was all kinds of other things going on, and one of those was the scholastic book market, those books, you can look at all ages material from Scholastic, from Random House, from Macmillan with First Second, through a lot of different publishers are finding that market. And it's a market that I think was partially built on the back of the Scholastic book fairs in schools, but those still only reach a small percentage of the students in those schools, they reach a small percentage of the total number of elementary schools there are. But this will be a really horrible analogy, but a lot of those books, the Scholastic books, they're like the COVID of comics. When one person gets it, everybody else gets it. And what I see when one young reader picks up Raina Telgemeyer's Smile, for instance, her friend looks over the shoulder and says, I want to read that next. And then it just gets passed on, and then I've got to have my own copy. And then has Raina Telgemeier done anything else? What about Gene Yang? I read that Secret Coders book. What else is there? And it's like, okay, here's Superman Smashes the Klan. It's like there are certain creators, Kaz Kibuishi from the Amulet series. It's fantastic stuff, and it's stuff that when we hand it to a reader, we know they're going to be back in a week or so for the next volume and just keep on coming back. Kids are probably the best salespeople for kids' comics. because it gets them invested in reading. It gets them invested in opening up their minds to new ways of looking at things. And they're the ones who are sort of quietly proselytizing to their other friends. And even during the coronavirus era, where most of the schools have been closed, somehow these kids know that there's a new Dog Man coming out, or a new Wimpy Kid, or whatever it is, and they find their way to our store because that's where they know the comics are. And it's been a pretty amazing thing to watch how things are happening on it, like these mini generational bases, from the kids who start with Captain Underpants and graduate to Dog Man, and then they maybe move on to Wimpy Kid, and then we'll get them into Secret Coders or Omelette or one of those. And so there's like this rolling 2 or 3 year period where they're totally into one property, and then they make it to the next property. And those books all wind up being among our bestsellers every single year. And it's a phenomenal thing. And if there's a downside to what happens inside the comics market and why the direct comics market has had a difficult time in finding a kids market, because they keep on trying to shoehorn their characters into things that maybe kids aren't all that crazy about. I think most kids want to read about, a lot of kids want to read about Batman or Spider-Man or whoever, but there's a different thing. It's a different level of escape to go to something that's totally new, that's not your parents, that's not your older brothers or sisters. It's your own thing for your own little mini generation. And that seems to be the way those books work really, really well, is passed from friend to friend, not necessarily down from brother to sister to brother again. It's more about, these are my friends and this is what they're into.
Right, your own voyage of discovery.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's we had a younger patron come into the library the other week. We have like a limited space open, and we have some selection of things, and people can pick up holds. And her mom sort of said, "Oh, she, doesn't like to read so much, so I'm hoping she'll read some stuff." And then the mom went away, and the kid was browsing, and it turns out she likes anime, and she knows what manga is. And she got, and there was my colleague was there. She's one of the librarians in the kids department, the children's department. And I was like, well, I said, listen, I'm not supposed to do this, but I'll go and get you these books, because they were elsewhere in the library. It was super slow. And I got them, and she started talking. We were talking. And then I said, oh, my colleague knows all about this. And then there was this thing, and she was putting all these things on hold, and she discovered all these things were, manga titles were in the library, and she could put a hold on it. And just seeing her sort of turn around and sort of say, basically say, actually, I love reading, it just happens to be graphic novels. It was a lovely thing to see.
Comics are reader breeders, and it's just about finding what appeals to each reader. And there's too often what happens is teachers, parents, even librarians, even comic book store owners, we may suggest things that aren't quite right, and so the interest isn't there. But if they find something that reaches them and becomes their own, it's off to the races. That's where things really work well. So sometimes it's not so much about the specific recommendation as it is about being introduced to the environment, and then allowing people to find their own best interests.
Yeah. So do you think? Let's loop slightly backwards in time. So tell us about Free Comic Book Day and how that came about.
Okay, so Free Comic Book Day is this crazy event that fortunately I brainstormed way back when. 2021 will be the 20th anniversary Free Comic Book Day, which kind of blows my mind because I'm from a sales background, and sales promotions on their own don't last. So it had to be something more than a sales promotion. But that's what Free Comic Book Day started at. It started as a way to invite people into shops so they could see what we have, give them something for free, give them that first scoop of ice cream before they come back for the gallon. And it's become, sort of a cultural phenomenon. It is now, over the last few years, other than our coronavirus year, it has become the world's largest comic book related event, which blows my mind. And almost every year I will hear from comic book retailers or librarians or other people who were involved with the event from all over the world. And it's a lot of fun to watch the progression of Free Comic Book Day when it starts, and it starts somewhere, in Australia, for instance, and then to watch it sort of circumnavigate the globe until it's done for another year. But the whole thing about Free Comic Book Day is it came about because I was on a deadline. I used to write columns for an industry trade magazine, and in that I would come up with ideas for the industry or just my thoughts about what was going on. And one day when I was pressed for a deadline, I looked out the window and I saw a long line out in front of the store, and it was for Baskin-Robbins Scoop Night. And so I talked to the owner of the franchise, and she said they did 1,200 scoops that night. And at her other store, they did 900 free scoops. And I kept on thinking to myself, comics are cooler than ice cream. And can't we do that? Can't we do something like that for comics? So I proposed it in my column, and unlike so many of the other columns I wrote that sort of disappeared into a vacuum, this one had some legs to it. And fortunately, all the people in the industry really wanted to jump on it. And the actual decision to make it go forward happened at the first industry meeting at a convention, the first industry meeting at post 9/11. So 3 weeks after 9/11, there was a convention in Las Vegas, and most of the publishers were making their first flight out of New York after 9/11. Things were still pretty raw, and it was very commonplace to do industry meetings where different publishers would be involved in the meeting, and the meetings would end with, your lawyer needs to talk to our lawyer. But in that meeting, we had to set up Free Comic Book Day with pretty much all the major players there. The spirit of camaraderie was off the charts. It was, we need to do this. And that was also at a convention where some of the benefit books post 9/11 were sprung, were put together, the initial deals for those. So I wonder sometimes if it had happened outside of that kind of fragile time frame, if it had ever have gone forward. But it's been a very, very much a big part of the comics calendar ever since. I'm very grateful to all the people who've worked on it. I get credit as the founder, but the amount of work that I do for it is minimal compared to what some others do. So I'm just happy that 20 years later, it's still a thing, and it's kind of a big deal in comics culture. It's not a sales promotion. It is something that can bring sales to shops, which is what the goal is. The whole goal was bring people into comic book stores, let them experience what happens in here, and they'll want to come back week after week.
Sure.
And so we've seen that play out, but more than that, it's just become it's become sort of a cultural phenomenon that kind of blows my mind when I think about it.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I've watched it grow. Over the years, and I mean, it's a national thing. It usually makes it onto, when that day rolls around. If you scan around on the internet, if you're an information, nerd like I am, you see that it's a story now. It's
Yeah.
Free Comics Book Day. Look, here's a line of 100 people all waiting.
I'll blow the horn a little. It's international. It's
Hmm.
I think the highest number of countries we've had involved with it in a year is something like 65. Um, that's considering where most of the world is, 65 countries involved in one thing at one time is kind of amazing.
It is amazing. Yeah, we at Altadena we started off 2 years ago, and we had a little event, and we had a panel as well, and it was great. We partnered with a local retailer, and a lot of our readers at the over 50% were kids coming up and getting stuff. And at the end of the day, we had like a limit of 2, but at the end of the day we had quite a few left over, so the kids that came later just were able to load up. And then we were going to do it the next year, and we had more programming involved, but that was 2020. So
Yeah.
kind of put the kibosh on that. We're doing a little thing. Well, it'll be broadcast on April 30th, and it's sort of in honor of around the time Free Comic Day normally would be. Also, May the 4th be with you, which is, of course,
Sure.
a cousin day. And so we're looking forward to that. We have some sort of we have the 2020 books, so we're gonna give those away, and do some Star Wars stuff too. But yeah, it's an amazing thing. Well, my local retailer, Comics Factory, they're actually considering, well, that year they were going to break things in 2, where they're going to have the comics fans come on the day, and in families, we're going to hand out flyers. Families get to come on the Sunday, because one of the problems is for them is their line is so long. If you've got a 6-year-old kid and you're 100 people back, that can be a tough wait. So they're expanding to have to continue the event for families the next day, which is, it's really lovely.
I'm always amazed at how every retailer finds a way to make it work for them. And there's still some that don't give it much of an effort and just throw the comics out there and let it be a free for all. But there are some really creative things that have happened with Free Comic Book Day, and I really get jazzed seeing what everybody's able to come up with. I had a meeting earlier this morning with a cartoonist friend of mine who we're putting together something that might be a surprise for Free Comic Book Day. So, yeah.
We'll keep an eye peeled on that. So what, kind of wrapping up, what do you, I mean, like when I was a kid, I used to sort of dream of like, oh, maybe they'll make an action figure of Galactus that's really tall, because they had these little action figures or things like that. And they, like, the Hulk was on TV, and I really was into it, but I could tell it was a little, they didn't have a lot of money to spend on this. Like the Hulk was always fighting gangsters. It wasn't like the comics. There wasn't this sort of scope of imagination. So, but I never quite really, in a way, I dreamed of a world as it is now, where there's pop culture everywhere. It's not just Marvel and DC. There's Harry Potter. There's all of any genre show, about fantasy is sort of a kindred thing to me.
Yes, it is.
And, those things have always been popular, but now they're such a part of the culture.
Well, the thing about comics, and the phrase I like to use is they're the gooey center of pop culture. Comics are the nexus of everything that springs into other media. And if you look at TV, you look at video games, you look at movies, you look at advertising, you look at any kind of visual medium, pretty much everything starts with that little storyboard, which is a comic. And so the comic artists have lots of outlets for doing things professionally. They may not just have to do comics. Maybe they do storyboards for film or TV or advertising. Maybe they work in video games. When I was a kid, we were much more text-based as a culture, and now we're far more visually based. It is maybe oversaturated visually. We get assaulted with all kinds of images, but it is definitely a visual culture we're in, and comics really play well into that, because A, there are comics for everybody, no matter what age or what interest, and B, there things that are helping people get out of the humdrum of their daily existence and going into strange new worlds or happier places or whatever. That escape is a really healthy thing, and comics work that way too. It's amazing to me, from the time that I started, falling out of that tree in 1967 to where we are now. I used to have to hide my comics in PG folders at school. I was, ostracized as being a geek or whatever. The geek shall inherit the earth, and that's. I really think comics are a huge part of that, and we now find that some of the smartest people in the world had their imagination sparked by comics when they were kids. And I don't think we're ever going to see a time when we go back to being heavily text-based, although there's amazing things that could be done just with words without pictures. And I would, definitely advocate for anybody to dive into novels once they've gotten the love of reading down from reading comics. Or nonfiction, doesn't have to, whatever, but it's comics sort of play an important role in terms of having people find their identity and find what they love, and then diving in whole hog, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, let's just, I know they're there. There's young people coming into Flying Colors comics today and tomorrow and next week. There's young people coming into the library, and they're the Shannon Mcguires of the future, or as you said, working in any form of art or entertainment or design, or maybe it just is going to fire their imaginations and they'll become scientists and design rockets and telescopes. It's really a great foundation.
It's a great way to open the mind and then fill it up with things that make you happy.
Indeed. Well, Joe, it's been a pleasure as always talking to you. It's been so nice to see you.
Yeah, and, great to see you.
Yeah, and maybe we can do this again sometime and see how things are in another year, a year that's a little more normal than this.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, we'll get there.
Okay.
All right, buddy. Thank you so much, and I'll see you soon.
Peace.